It was late September when I finally decided to go out to the cabin. The weather was starting to cool off, and the leaves were turning those deep, fiery shades that only autumn can bring. I'd been avoiding this place for a long time, but after everything that happened with Emily, I thought it would be a good idea to get some space, to think things over, to reflect. Not that I could avoid the memories, but maybe being alone would help me put things in perspective. The cabin had always been a retreat for both of us, a small, weathered structure nestled on the edge of a forest in the Catskill Mountains. Emily and I had bought it years ago, back when we were still in love and dreaming about a future together. It had a cozy charm, wooden walls, stone fireplace, a loft that overlooked the living room, and a wraparound porch that, on clear days, gave a sweeping view of the valley below. I wasn't sure why I decided to go back after the divorce. Maybe it was some misguided attempt to reclaim a piece of what we had. I thought being there alone would be easier, quieter. But every step I took toward the cabin brought the past rushing back. I could still hear her laughter in the kitchen as she cooked breakfast. I could almost smell the scent of her favorite candle burning in the living room. It wasn't just a cabin to me. It was a graveyard of lost memories. I parked the truck, gathered my bags, and walked up the creaky steps to the front door. The wood was a little more weathered than I remembered, the porch swing hanging crooked as if the wind had been playing with it for too long. I fumbled with the key in the lock, then stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the faint musty smell of old wood and unused spaces hit me right away. The floorboards groaned beneath my boots, and I felt the cabin's silence almost suffocating. It wasn't the peaceful solitude I'd hoped for. It felt heavy, like the place itself was holding onto its past, refusing to let go. The first thing I did was open the windows. The air outside was crisp, and the breeze brought with it the smell of pine and damp earth. I hadn't realized how claustrophobic the place had become over the years. It felt smaller now. Maybe it was just me, maybe it was the lingering memories of her. But I didn't remember the cabin feeling this stifling when we had spent our weekends here. I set my bags down and took a long look around. Everything was still there. The old furniture, the mismatched rugs, the pictures on the wall that we had picked out together. I stood for a moment, staring at one of the photos, a picture of us hiking on the mountain trail near the cabin. We looked so happy then, so carefree. It was hard to imagine that version of us now. I tried to shake off the melancholy that was creeping up on me, so I started a fire in the stone fireplace. There was something comforting about the crackle of burning wood, something primal that made me feel a little less alone. I sat on the couch, staring into the flames, my mind wandering to the days when everything seemed simpler. But then it would shift, and I'd remember why we weren't together anymore. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned that deep shade of navy blue, the air inside the cabin started to grow colder. The fire in the hearth was keeping the chill at bay, but there was something about the night that felt different. The wind outside picked up, whistling through the trees, and I could hear the occasional thud of a branch falling to the ground. The peace I had hoped for was elusive. Every sound, no matter how small, seemed amplified in the silence of the cabin. The wind outside began to howl, and I could hear the rustle of leaves scraping against the windows. I tried to focus on the warmth from the fire, but my mind kept wandering back to the night of the accident. It was 2 years ago now, but the memory was still so fresh. We'd been on our way back from a hiking trip, our usual trail through the woods, but something had gone wrong. A flash flood hit without warning, and we found ourselves trapped on the mountain. The waters rose so quickly. Emily had been terrified, and I couldn't get to her fast enough, couldn't save her. By the time I reached her, she had already slipped from my grasp. I tried to do everything I could, but in the end, I had to leave her behind. She drowned in front of me, and I couldn't even bring her body back. The authorities had found her a week later, but by then, it was too late. That night, the storm had hit hard, and I was stuck in the cabin. I thought I saw something moving in the woods outside, a shadow shifting between the trees, but when I stepped out onto the porch to investigate, nothing was there. It was a trick of the light, or maybe it was my mind playing games with me. But now, with the wind howling outside and the fire casting strange, dancing shadows on the walls, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was as if the forest around the cabin was alive, watching me, waiting for something. I heard a thud outside, a heavy footstep, followed by a series of faint rustling sounds, like someone walking through the underbrush, trying to be quiet. My heart rate quickened as I stood, frozen in place. Was it an animal? Couldn't tell. I stepped toward the door, but as soon as I reached for the handle, the sound stopped. It was unnerving. For the next few hours, I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the wind or some wild animal moving through the trees. But the longer I stayed awake, the more restless I became. I thought about checking the porch, but the idea of stepping out into the cold night with that uneasy feeling gnawing at me kept me inside. As the night wore on, I tried to sleep, but the sounds continued. Footsteps, scratching at the walls, the wind howling louder and louder, making the old wood of the cabin creak under its pressure. I finally got up and grabbed the flashlight, deciding to check the perimeter of the cabin. I opened the door cautiously, the cool air hitting me immediately. My breath formed clouds in the cold night. I panned the flashlight across the trees, searching for any movement. Nothing. The night was still, except for the wind swaying the branches above me. The rustling noise had stopped. Then I saw it, a shape in the trees. It was brief, just a silhouette, but it was there. Person. At least it looked like one. I took a step forward, squinting, trying to get a better look, but the figure disappeared into the shadows. My heart pounded in my chest. Was it a person? A hiker? No, there were no trails out here. The only people who knew about this cabin were me and Emily, well, her family too. But no one had come up this way in years. I called out, but the wind seemed to swallow my words. Silence. My instincts told me to go back inside and lock the door, but I couldn't move. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the figure to reappear. When it didn't, I turned and went back inside, securing the door behind me. I didn't know what to think anymore, but I knew one thing. I wasn't staying out there alone for another minute. I set the flashlight down on the table, grabbed my phone, and called the local sheriff's office. The line clicked and a voice came on the other end. I explained the situation, though I wasn't sure what I was really explaining. What was I supposed to say? That I saw a figure outside my cabin in the woods at night? When the sheriff arrived, it was close to dawn. They checked around the cabin, but found no sign of anyone. No footprints, no disturbed earth, no signs of anything unusual. The only thing they mentioned was the strange shape of the tree near the back of the cabin, which had an eerie look to it. Something about the way the branches hung made it appear as though it had arms reaching toward the sky. I wasn't sure if that made me feel better or worse, but when the sheriff left, I decided to spend one more night before I packed up and left for good. The rest of the trip was uneventful. I slept soundly the second night, though I didn't stay for long after that. The cabin had once been a place of refuge, a spot I'd shared with Emily, full of happiness and peace. But now it felt different. I felt like it was a place I needed to leave behind, a place where the past had too strong a hold over me. I realized, standing there in the early morning light, that I couldn't stay here anymore. The memories, the ghosts of everything that had happened, were too much. And so I left. As I drove away, I thought about everything I'd been through, everything I'd lost. But in that moment, I felt the weight lifting just a little. The cabin had done its job, and now I was ready to move on. I had been looking forward to the hunting trip for months. The cabin was secluded, far from any towns or roads, and that was exactly what I needed. Peace and quiet with a little bit of adventure thrown in. It was late October in the mountains of Wyoming. The leaves were mostly gone, the air crisp, and the weather unpredictable. I was in my mid-30s, a regular guy who worked a desk job in Denver. But when the weekend came, I liked to get away from all that. Breathe the fresh mountain air, enjoy the solitude, and maybe, just maybe, get lucky and bag a decent elk or mule deer. I packed my gear carefully. A rifle, a few boxes of ammo, a warm sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, and a couple of flashlights just in case. The cabin wasn't much. Just a small, single-room structure with a wood stove for heat and a few basic furnishings. It had been around for decades, built by the previous owner's grandfather, and had a charm to it that modern cabins couldn't match. A rustic feel, the smell of pine, and a general quiet that made it feel like time slowed down the moment you stepped inside. The drive up was long but pleasant, the road winding through dense forests and steep hills. By the time I reached the cabin, it was dusk, and the sky was already fading to purple. The cabin's small front porch was just as I remembered it. Old wood, chipped paint, but sturdy. The place was remote enough that it had no electricity, which was part of the appeal. No distractions, no noise, just the sounds of the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves. I set up quickly, unpacking my gear, gathering some firewood for the stove, and lighting a lantern. The cabin had a stone fireplace, and I built a small fire, the crackling sound filling the silence. It wasn't too cold yet, but it would drop to freezing later, so I made sure to stay warm. After eating a quick dinner of jerky and trail mix, I settled in for the night. The first night passed quietly. The wind picked up, howling outside, and I listened to the sounds of it against the trees. The floor creaked occasionally, and I could hear some small animals rummaging around outside. All typical stuff for a cabin in the woods. Nothing out of the ordinary. The next morning, I woke up early to get to the hunt. The air was crisp, the sky clear with a hint of frost on the ground. I grabbed my rifle, pulled on my boots, and headed out into the forest. The trees were still mostly bare, their skeletal branches reaching toward the sky. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel small, insignificant even. The ground was crunchy beneath my boots, the scent of pine strong in the air. I made my way through the woods, scanning the area for signs of wildlife. I didn't see anything that morning, but I wasn't discouraged. The forest had its rhythms, and patience was key. I took a break by a small creek, sat down on a rock, and ate some granola. The sun was low in the sky by the time I decided to head back to the cabin. I hadn't ventured too far out. The last thing I wanted was to get lost in the wilderness. When I returned, I noticed something strange. The front door, which I had locked when I left, was slightly ajar. At first, I thought I might have forgotten to close it properly, but when I stepped inside, I saw something that immediately sent a shiver down my spine. The wood stove had been turned off. I had left it on before I left, with a small fire burning to keep the cabin warm. But now it was cold. The fire had long since died out, and the metal stove was cold to the touch. My heart rate quickened. I wasn't the type to get paranoid, but this wasn't right. I checked the rest of the cabin, moving quickly but quietly. Nothing was out of place. My gear was still where I had left it, and there were no signs of forced entry. I chalked it up to a lapse in memory. Maybe the wind had pushed the door open. But the stove was a different matter. It wasn't just that it had gone out. It was the fact that I hadn't touched it since I left. That night, I made sure to lock the door and double-check everything before I went to bed. My rifle stayed close by, and I kept a flashlight next to me. I tried to tell myself I was overthinking things. After all, I was in the middle of nowhere, and who would be around to mess with me? But still, there was an unease that lingered in my chest, a quiet voice telling me something wasn't quite right. The second night was even quieter than the first. The wind had died down, and all I could hear was the occasional crackle of the fire. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as if someone was out there, just beyond the reach of the light. I kept the lantern burning low and tried to sleep, but every little noise seemed to set me on edge. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside the cabin. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, as if someone was walking slowly, carefully, right outside. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't move at first, too scared to even breathe. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and I held my breath, listening. Then they started again, closer this time. I couldn't see anything through the small cabin window, but I knew someone, or something, was out there. I grabbed my rifle, my hands shaking. The footsteps continued for what felt like an eternity, circling the cabin, stopping every now and then, only to start again. I pressed my back against the wall and stayed still, praying that whoever or whatever it was would leave. But they didn't. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They stopped right outside the door. I could hear my pulse in my ears, the pounding rhythm too loud in the silence of the cabin. Then, there was a soft scraping sound, like something dragging along the ground, just outside the door. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't tell if it was a person, an animal, or something else. I just knew that I wasn't alone anymore. The door handle jiggled. I froze, my grip tightening on the rifle. Whoever it was trying to open the door. The sound of it, the rattling handle, the soft creak of the wood. It made my blood run cold. I had no choice. I couldn't wait any longer. I stood up, raised my rifle, and slowly moved toward the door. The noise stopped just as I was about to open it. It was like whoever or whatever had been out there knew I was coming. I opened the door quickly, rifle aimed at the darkness. But there was nothing. No one. I stepped outside, scanning the area. The ground around the cabin was undisturbed, the air still. There were no footprints, no signs of anyone being there. The trees loomed in the distance, their branches swaying gently in the wind. But nothing else. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, the rifle close, every little sound setting me on edge. The rest of the night was uneventful, but I didn't feel safe. Whoever or whatever had been out there knew I was alone, and that thought stuck with me. The next morning, I packed up my things quickly, not even bothering with a second cup of coffee. The place had lost its charm. I locked the cabin behind me, and with one last look at the empty, quiet forest, I drove away. As I made my way back down the mountain road, the sun began to rise. The unsettling feeling still lingered in my gut, but the further I got from the cabin, the more the tension seemed to melt away. It wasn't until I got home and unpacked that I noticed something strange. There, in the lining of my backpack, was a small, folded piece of paper. I hadn't put it there, and when I opened it up, it was blank. Nothing written on it, just white paper. I can't explain it, but whatever happened up there in that cabin, it wasn't normal. And something about that place, about the strange feeling in my gut, makes me wonder if I'll ever really know what happened. But I don't plan on going back to find out. I had been working a desk job in San Jose for about 7 years straight. By early spring of 2022, I was getting worn down, mentally, physically, everything. I was 29 and feeling like I was turning into someone I didn't even recognize. The kind of guy who woke up to emails, answered them in bed, and didn't leave the apartment for 2 days except to grab instant noodles and black coffee. I needed to get out. No people, no phone signal, no screens. Just me, quiet, and hopefully some air that didn't smell like hot pavement. So I found this cabin listed by a rancher just outside Blanding, Utah. He had a few old logging cabins up on the eastern edge of the Idaho mountains, way off any paved road. He rented one out online occasionally for hunters or hikers, and it was cheap, like too cheap, but I didn't care. I just wanted away. I drove out on a Tuesday. It took me almost 12 hours to get there with all the gas stops and winding back roads. The last 30 miles were just rough dirt and gravel that scraped the bottom of my car more than once. The land out there was empty, like really empty. Miles and miles of nothing but pines, scrubland, and red dust.
No fences.
No gas stations. No cars coming the other way. Just birds, wind, and silence that rang louder than any city noise. The cabin sat on a kind of small, bald hill just west of a dry gulch. The roof looked weather-beaten, and there were old tire tracks leading up to it, mostly filled in with dust. The structure was simple. One room, wooden floorboards, a metal stove in the corner, a fold-out bed, and a little porch. There was no electricity, just a couple of propane lanterns and a half-full tank for the stove. The rancher had left a few jugs of water, canned food, and an old .22 rifle with a sticky bolt on the rack above the door. I had brought my own supplies too, granola, jerky, my hiking pack, and a paper map because I knew GPS wouldn't work. By the time I unpacked and got settled, the sun was low. The desert turns cold fast after sunset. The pines went from golden green to black in about 10 minutes. I lit one of the propane lanterns, ate a cold can of beans, and sat on the porch for a while, watching the light fade. It was quiet out there, too quiet. No buzzing from power lines, no faraway traffic hum. The wind moved through the trees like someone breathing slow and steady. That first night, I didn't sleep much. Not because of noise, but because of how still everything was. You know how your ears ring when there's no sound at all? It was like that. I kept waking up expecting to hear something. A branch cracking, a howl in the distance. But it was just silence. Cold, full silence. I woke around 6 the next morning. The sun had just started to warm the air. I made coffee over a small propane flame and decided to hike the ridge north of the cabin. I followed a narrow deer trail up the slope, weaving between pine trunks and scraggly underbrush. The land dipped and rose gently, scattered with fallen logs and patches of dry grass. No one had been out here in a long time. There were no footprints except mine. I did spot some animal tracks, coyote, maybe a bobcat, but nothing big. Nothing fresh. About 2 hours into the hike, I found an old fire ring. Stones arranged in a rough circle with charred wood inside. Looked like it hadn't been used in years. There were bones nearby, animal bones bleached by the sun. Long ones, maybe deer, maybe elk. They'd been chewed on. I figured it was normal. Wild animals, old campfires. But something about it made me uneasy. Felt wrong somehow, like the bones had been placed deliberately near the fire ring. Too close, too clean. I left soon after and made my way back to the cabin, feeling uneasy but telling myself I was just being paranoid. Back at the cabin, I read a paperback I'd brought and ate jerky. The silence was constant. No birds that day, not a single one. That bothered me. That night I heard something. It was just after midnight, I think. I had the lantern turned low and was lying in the cot, not quite asleep. Then I heard it, footsteps. Slow, careful footsteps outside on the dirt. Not heavy like boots, but definitely not animal-like either. Too slow, too cautious, like someone trying not to be heard. My heart started thudding. I froze completely. The sound circled the cabin once. Gravel crunching. A stick snapped, then silence. I waited a long time, maybe 20 minutes. I finally got up, quietly pulled the bolt-action rifle down, and crept to the window. There was no one. Nothing moved in the dark. I stayed awake until the sky turned blue. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. I found prints.
Bare footprints.
Human ones.
No shoes, no socks.
Just heel-to-toe imprints in the fine dust. They circled the cabin once, then disappeared into the tree line. They weren't mine. They were bigger, wider, and the stride was off, like the gait was a little strange, uneven. I started seriously thinking about leaving that morning, but I convinced myself it was probably just someone messing around. A hiker or a squatter, maybe even a prankster. I mean, I was alone in the middle of nowhere. People do weird things, and there are weird people out there. Still, I didn't leave. I wish I had. That afternoon, I stayed near the cabin. I kept the rifle close and filled up some water jugs at a nearby creek. Around dusk, I found something else. There was a dead rabbit hanging from the tree behind the outhouse. Its legs were tied together with thin strands of what looked like plant fiber. Its stomach had been slit open and emptied. No blood on the ground, just hanging there like some kind of offering or message. I didn't touch it. I just stared at it for a long time. Then I walked back inside and locked the door. That night was worse. Just after dark, I heard the footsteps again. This time they didn't circle. They stopped right by the front door. I could hear slow breathing, like someone crouched just outside, waiting. Then the doorknob moved. Just a little, a twitch. Then again, a slight rattle, like someone trying to test it without making noise. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe for almost a full minute. My fingers gripped the rifle stock so hard they hurt. Finally, the sound stopped. I waited another hour before I got up and blocked the door with the heavy wood stove. Then I sat in the corner, shaking, until daylight. When I went outside that morning, the rabbit was gone. Completely. No rope, no blood, nothing on the ground. Just bare footprints again, this time leading from the tree to the porch, then disappearing down the hill. That was it. I packed up. I wanted out. I didn't care if I had to sleep in my car or drive straight through the night. I threw my pack into the back seat, loaded the rifle, and started down the dirt road fast. But 5 miles out, I found a tree across the path. A whole damn pine tree. It hadn't fallen naturally. It was dragged. I could see the dirt trench where the roots had been pulled. The tree was fresh cut, probably during the night. Someone didn't want me to leave. I got out and tried to move it.
No luck.
Too heavy. I even tried backing up and driving around it through the brush, but the terrain was too steep. So I hiked back to the cabin against every instinct I had. I didn't have signal. I didn't have a satellite phone. I was stuck. Back inside, I barred the door and kept the rifle loaded. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the floor, facing the door, waiting. Sometime after midnight, I heard something crawling on the roof. Not walking, asterisk crawling star. Light, quick scrapes of nails or fingers against the metal. I held the rifle up and just stared at the ceiling. Then soft breathing again, right above me. Then it stopped. In the morning, I walked around the cabin. No marks on the roof. No prints on the ground. Nothing. But I knew what I heard. That final day, I was determined. I hiked down the road to where the tree blocked the path. I had brought a hatchet from the cabin and started cutting. Took hours, but I got through enough of the branches to move it with the car. I was covered in sweat, shaking, but I got through. I didn't go back for the rest of my stuff. I left the rifle, the food, everything. I just drove. The sun was low, and I didn't stop until I hit pavement 3 hours later. When I got back to San Jose, I filed a report with the local sheriff's office in Blanding. They said they'd checked the cabin, but I never heard back. I looked for updates online. Nothing. A few months later, the listing was gone, like it had never been there. I don't know who or what was out there, but it wasn't an animal. It was someone, maybe more than one. Someone who knew how to move without being seen. Someone who wanted me scared, and they got what they wanted. I haven't gone camping since. Not once. I don't hike anymore. I moved to a high-rise apartment, got cameras, and sleep with earplugs. Because sometimes when I lie in bed at night, I swear I can still hear it. That soft, slow breathing, just outside the door. It was October 2021, and I was 33 years old. I had taken a few days off from work to clear my head and get away from the city for a while. I worked at a construction equipment supplier in Boise, Idaho, and things had been hectic for months. I was burnt out. I just wanted peace and quiet somewhere remote. No phone signal, no traffic, no people. I found a listing online for a small cabin up in the mountains, about 3.5 hours northeast of Boise, near a place called Warren. It was owned by an older guy who kept it maintained for hikers and hunters who wanted to rent it for short stays. It didn't have any fancy amenities, no electricity, no running water. Just a wood stove, a cot, and a couple of chairs. It was basic, but that was exactly what I wanted. I packed light, just some canned food, a gas lantern, a good sleeping bag, my knife, a hatchet, a small camping stove, and a few odds and ends. I also brought a Ruger .22 rifle and a small Smith & Wesson .38 snub nose. Not because I was expecting trouble, but because it's what I always brought on solo trips like that. I've done a lot of hiking and camping since I was a teenager. You never know what might happen out there. The drive was long, and the last hour was just dirt road winding up into the hills. I lost cell signal not long after I left the highway. By the time I got to the trailhead where I had to park and hike the last half mile, it was already getting late in the afternoon. The air was crisp and thin. It had snowed lightly the week before, and some of it still lingered in the shaded parts under the trees. I should have been more careful about my timing. I had maybe 45 minutes of daylight left when I slung my pack over my shoulders and locked the truck. I had a GPS and I'd studied the map. The trail was clear and simple, but still I moved fast. The cabin was just like the photos, small, square, with a sloped tin roof and a small front porch. No windows on the sides, just one in the back above the cot. It sat in a little clearing, surrounded by tall pine trees, and there was a fire pit with a few stumps arranged around it like seats. There were old beer cans and a melted plastic bottle half stuck to a blackened rock, but otherwise it looked like it hadn't been used much recently. I stepped up to the porch and pushed the door open. It creaked on the hinges and let out a puff of cold, dusty air. The inside smelled like dry wood, ash, and old sweat. The cot was folded against the wall, the wood stove sat in the far corner, and the shelves had a few leftover supplies. Matches, some candles, a rusted can opener, and a few bent nails in a plastic peanut butter jar. The floor was uneven and creaked when I walked, but it felt solid enough. I got to work fast. I swept the place out with a pine branch broom I found leaning behind the stove. I started a fire with kindling from the box and added a couple logs. The smoke backed up a little at first, and I had to swing the door open to let it clear, but once it got going, it warmed up fast. I laid out my sleeping bag on the cot, unpacked a few things, and set up the lantern on the little side table. By the time I had dinner going, just a can of chili heated on the small gas stove, it was fully dark outside. There's a certain kind of silence that only happens deep in the mountains. Not the kind of quiet you get in a library or at night in your house, but a complete absence of anything. No hum of refrigerators, no cars outside, no people talking. Just the occasional creak of a tree or a gust of wind that seems to come from nowhere. I sat on the porch after dinner with the lantern off and my jacket zipped up to my neck, just watching the sky. That first night passed quietly. I woke up a couple times because the cot was stiff and my shoulders were sore, but nothing seemed off. In the morning, I stepped out into a cold mist and made some instant coffee with water I'd melted from snow in a metal pot. My plan for the day was just to hike the area, maybe follow the ridge that looped around the east side of the property. I packed a day bag with water, some snacks, and the .22 rifle. I left the pistol in my sleeping bag, tucked in the bottom corner with my flashlight. The hike was nice, quiet. I saw deer tracks, some rabbit scat, and one spot where something had dug a hole not long before. Probably a fox or coyote. I didn't see any people, not even distant campers or boot prints. Felt like I was the only one out there. I moved slow and got back to the cabin around mid-afternoon. I was muddy, a little sweaty, and hungry. I changed shirts, washed my face with melted snow, and heated up some beans and rice. It was about 5:30 when I noticed something that stuck with me. I was sitting on the porch again, just watching the trees sway when I realized the fire pit had been moved. Not just a little. One of the stumps, one I had been sitting on the night before, was flipped over. Another one was turned a full 90 degrees. At first, I thought maybe I was just remembering wrong. I even pulled up the photos I'd taken when I first got there. Nope, it was definitely different. That made my stomach tighten a little. I stood up and walked around the cabin to see if I could find any footprints, but the ground was still hard and dry under the trees. Nothing but a few pine cones and a scatter of snow melt. I tried to shake it off. Maybe an animal, maybe the wind, maybe I did it and forgot, but I knew I hadn't. That night, I kept my pistol closer. I kept the lantern on lower and put it behind the chair instead of on the windowsill. I also dragged the little table in front of the door before I went to bed. Not because I thought it would stop anyone, but just so I'd hear if someone opened it. I didn't sleep much that night. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, I heard something outside. Not close, maybe a little ways down the slope behind the cabin. Just a soft crack of a branch, like something big stepped on it. I sat up and turned off the lantern. I held my breath for a while and listened. Nothing else. I told myself it was just an elk or a bear. I'd seen signs of both on the drive up. The next morning, there were no tracks. Nothing was moved, but the smell outside was different. Hard to describe, but sharp, like sweat and wet leather. It was faint, but it was there near the side of the cabin where the window was. I didn't hike that day. I stayed close. I chopped a few small logs with the hatchet, tried to stay busy. My phone was still dead. No signal, of course. And I hadn't seen a car or person since I left the main road. I sat with my rifle across my lap most of the day. At some point around noon, I thought I saw movement up the hill past the tree line. Just a flash of dark shape behind a pine. But when I squinted and stepped closer, it was gone. Could have been an animal. Could have been nothing. That night was the worst. I ate early, locked the door, and killed the lantern by 9 o'clock. I lay in the cot in the dark with my ears wide open and my hand on the pistol under my pillow. I didn't hear anything for a while. Then, just after midnight, there was a knock. Not a loud knock, just a single, soft, deliberate knock. Came from the back wall of the cabin, right under the window. I didn't move. My breath froze in my chest. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a tree branch. It was a knock, a knuckle against the wood. Then I heard a footstep, just one, crunching on snow. I sat up slow, pulled the pistol out, and waited. I stayed like that for maybe an hour. Nothing else happened. No more sounds. No more knocking. Eventually, I got up, walked barefoot across the floor, and peeked out through the side crack in the shutters. Nothing, just black trees and stars. I didn't sleep again. In the morning, I packed up fast. I didn't even eat. I loaded my gear, stomped out the fire, and swept the floor. I left everything how I found it, except for the front door. I jammed a broken piece of wood under the handle so it wouldn't shut right. I hiked back to my truck fast, and the whole time I felt like I was being watched. I kept checking behind me. At one point, I stopped and listened, and I swear I heard another set of footsteps stop a few seconds after mine. When I got to the truck, I threw my gear in the back and didn't even take off my pack before starting the engine. I drove straight down the dirt road without stopping. I didn't check my phone until I hit the main road an hour later. No messages, no missed calls. I got home by sunset, and for the first time in days, I slept with the lights on. I reported what happened to the guy who rented the cabin. I didn't accuse him of anything, just told him someone might be messing around out there. He said no one else had booked it in over a month. He even asked if I left the door like that on purpose. I didn't reply. I haven't been back since. I still hike. I still camp sometimes, but never alone, and never that deep off the grid. There's something about being completely isolated that changes the way you think. You realize just how far away help really is. That knock never left my head. Whoever it was didn't break in, didn't shout, didn't try to open the door. They just knocked, once, like they wanted me to know they were there. And then they left, or watched. Whatever they wanted, they didn't get it that night. But I still wonder what would have happened if I had gone to the window, if I'd looked out, if I'd answered the knock. I never will. I didn't plan on staying in the woods that long. I just wanted a weekend away from people. I'd been working construction jobs nonstop for 8 months in Spokane, and my body was breaking down. I was 33, single, no kids, and most days I didn't talk to anyone unless it was about drywall or concrete. My head hurt more often than it didn't, and I hadn't really slept right in weeks. The idea of being alone, really alone, in the middle of nowhere sounded perfect. I remembered this old cabin I'd seen when I was a teenager, back when my uncle used to take me deer hunting in the forests outside Republic, Washington. We'd never gone inside the place. It was probably abandoned even back then, but we passed it more than once during those long walks through the woods. It sat about 2 miles from the old logging road and was easy to miss unless you were paying attention. I always thought it looked like something out of an old western, all gray wood and rusted metal, half swallowed by trees. So I packed up my old Tacoma on a Friday morning in mid-September, threw in my sleeping bag, a couple of coolers, my .45 just in case, and headed out. The plan was simple. Hike to the cabin, sleep there 2 nights, hike back, and go home Monday morning before sunrise. No phone, no laptop, no people. Just air, trees, and maybe a few cans of cheap beer by a fire. It was early afternoon when I parked the truck and locked it. I followed the old trail, what was left of it, into the woods. It was quiet, real quiet. No traffic sounds, no engines, just wind and dry leaves. The trees out there are tall and packed tight, and by the time I got half a mile in, I couldn't hear or see anything that reminded me of the outside world. I didn't need GPS. My feet remembered the path even if I didn't consciously know every turn. The trail was overgrown, but the land still sloped the same way. The trees still leaned in that odd direction where a storm had blown through years ago. There were parts one had to duck or push through, but I found the cabin faster than I expected. It was exactly where I thought it'd be, buried deep in a thicket of pine, moss creeping up the wood, roof caved in partially on the far side. It didn't look like anyone had touched it in decades. The door wasn't locked. There wasn't even a handle anymore, just a gap where one used to be. I pushed it open with my boot and stepped inside. Dust and dry rot hit me in the face. The whole place smelled like wet dirt and animal piss. There was a table in the center, or what used to be one, with one leg missing and a cracked metal lantern lying on its side. Against the back wall sat a rusted wood stove and a pile of collapsed chairs. Something had definitely nested here at some point. I saw a few bones, probably squirrel or rabbit, in one corner and some shredded cloth. Still, it felt better than sleeping in a tent. The walls were still standing. No real drafts. It was quiet, and that's what I came for. I set my bag down, opened one of the windows a crack, and lit a citronella candle I'd brought, just to cut the smell a little. Then I sat outside on a moss-covered log and cracked open a beer. The forest stretched around me like an ocean, Nothing but trees and birds and the occasional squirrel. No people, no noise. That night, I slept surprisingly well. The floor was hard, but my sleeping mat helped. It was cold, but I was layered up. I didn't hear anything strange, just wind and branches creaking. No animals, no footsteps. I think I slept almost 9 hours. I hadn't done that in years. The next day I spent walking. No hunting, just wandering. The deeper you go out there, the weirder it feels. Not supernatural or anything, just off. Like the forest doesn't want you there, but it's too old to care enough to stop you. I found a stream I barely remembered from childhood and drank from it. Probably stupid, but I didn't care. I was feeling good. Peace. When I got back to the cabin around 4 in the afternoon, I noticed something I hadn't before. A long, shallow trench in the dirt, leading from the back side of the cabin out into the woods. It wasn't fresh. The leaves had settled in it, but it hadn't been there when I was a kid. Something big had been dragged, probably years ago, maybe a fallen tree. But it was too straight, too even. I walked along it a few feet, then stopped. It led right up to a tree that had a chain wrapped around its base. The chain was half buried, rusted almost to nothing, and led into the ground. I didn't dig it up or anything, just stared at it for a while, then walked back to the cabin. It didn't sit right with me. Something about it felt wrong, but not in a horror movie kind of way. Just in a real gut level, don't screw around with this kind of way. That night I couldn't sleep. The wind picked up around midnight, and I kept hearing little scratches on the wall. Probably animals, maybe a raccoon or squirrel, but it got to me. I sat up in my sleeping bag and just listened. Around 2:30 a.m., I thought I heard something bigger. Not movement, breathing, not right outside, just near enough that I couldn't write it off. I held my breath and waited. Nothing. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I walked back to the chain and stared at it again. I thought about digging it up, seeing what it was tied to, but I didn't. It wasn't curiosity that stopped me. It was the feeling that I'd regret knowing. Instead, I packed my things early and decided to head back to the truck. One night early. No shame in that. I'd gotten what I came for. Peace. Time alone. But as I walked away, maybe 50 feet from the cabin, I realized I'd left my hunting knife inside. It wasn't expensive, but it had belonged to my uncle. I turned back. The cabin looked smaller coming from the other direction. Sadder. I stepped inside again, the air colder now, and looked around for the knife. Found it near the window on top of my rolled-up jacket. I grabbed it and turned to leave, and that's when I saw the floor. The boards near the corner where I hadn't walked were different. There was a square cutout, barely visible under a layer of dust. A trapdoor. I don't know why I opened it. Maybe I thought I'd find old tools or gear. Maybe I was just too tired to think straight. I pulled it up with both hands. It groaned and cracked but came loose. The smell hit me first, like wet meat and mold. There was a ladder made from 2x4s nailed into the wall going down into darkness. I clicked on my flashlight. The space below was about 8 feet deep and lined with dirt walls. A root cellar, maybe, but it wasn't empty. There were shelves, makeshift ones, nailed together from scraps, and on them were boxes, tin cans, tools, and other things. A rope, a broken pair of glasses, a bone. Not animal. I felt sick. I climbed down anyway against every instinct. Just a few steps, just enough to see better. There were 3 metal crates, one already open. Inside it were rags and what looked like a stained boot. The smell was worse now, wet fabric, old blood. I backed up fast, hit my head on the low ceiling, and scrambled back up the ladder. I slammed the trapdoor shut and left. I didn't run, but I wanted to. Back at the truck, I sat in the driver's seat for 10 minutes before starting the engine. My hands shook. I didn't know what I'd found. I didn't want to know. Someone had used that cabin for something bad, something awful, and I'd slept right above it. I drove to the nearest ranger station, about 40 minutes away, and told them everything. Not everything, just enough. The chain, the trapdoor, the crates. They looked concerned, took notes, asked me to show them. I said I could. They brought 2 officers. We went back out that evening. They went down into the cellar and came back up with a full bag of what they called evidence. One of them said quietly to the other that it matched the missing persons case from '94. They didn't say much else to me, took my name, number, told me I'd probably get a call. Then they thanked me and let me go. I never heard back. I checked the news for weeks. Nothing. No story. No names. No arrests. That cabin's probably still out there, rotting under the trees with the same trapdoor and the same chain still buried under the roots of that tree. Maybe the evidence got lost in the system. Maybe someone covered it up. But I know what I saw, and I'll never go back out there again. I was 32 when I took that trip to the Peak District, late autumn 2017. I'd been working straight through most of the year, picking up shifts whenever I could. I'd burned out without realizing it. One night, after falling asleep at my desk for the second time in a week, I booked a week off. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't even have a clear plan. I just knew I needed to go somewhere quiet, away from people and noise, and let my head settle. A few days later, I found a listing for a small cabin just outside a village called Chelmsford Wood. It was on the edge of a wooded area, with not much nearby apart from trails, fields, and farmland. The pictures showed a small timber structure, 1 floor, a narrow porch, a wood stove, and a view out onto the trees. It was the kind of place you could spend a week in total silence if you wanted. I booked it for 6 nights and drove up the following Friday. I arrived in the afternoon. The sky had already started to go gray, and there was a bite in the air. The final road was narrow and winding, barely enough space for 1 car, with moss along the middle. The cabin sat at the end of a gravel path, just out of sight of the road. It was surrounded by trees on 3 sides, most of them bare now that the cold had crept in. A small clearing stretched out behind it, leading down into more woods. There were no neighbors in sight. I hadn't passed another house for at least a half mile. I parked the car, unlocked the door with the key I'd picked up from a little shop in the village, and stepped inside. It smelled faintly of pine wood and old stone. The inside was simple wooden floors, a small kitchen in one corner, a narrow bed against the wall, and a little cast iron stove in the center of the main room. There was a bathroom at the back with a compost toilet and a cold water sink. There was no Wi-Fi, no TV, no radio, just a few books on a shelf, a kettle, and an old torch. The first night was peaceful. I sat outside on the porch for a while, listening to the wind moving through the trees and the occasional rustle of some animal in the undergrowth. I made tea, cooked a simple meal, and read one of the books I found, a worn old crime novel with cracked pages. I slept surprisingly well, considering how unfamiliar the place was. It was on the second day that I noticed the woman. Not properly, just a brief glimpse. I'd gone for a walk in the late morning, following a trail that led into the woods behind the cabin. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, damp and soft under my boots. I walked for about half an hour before stopping to drink some water and turn back. That's when I saw movement between the trees, off to my right. First, I thought it was a deer, but the shape was upright, human. It was distant, maybe 50 meters away, and only visible through a gap in the trees. She was wearing what looked like a long, dark coat, and her hair was gray or silver, pulled back tight. She didn't move like a hiker. She wasn't walking or pacing. She was just standing there. I turned away and kept walking. I didn't want to stare. I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe she lived nearby. Maybe she was just out for a walk like me. But still, it felt strange. There was something about how still she was. Something off. Back at the cabin, I made some food and tried to forget about it. I told myself I was just being jumpy, overthinking. I come out here to be alone, and now I was nervous because I'd seen someone. It didn't make sense. That night, I sat on the porch again, wrapped in my coat, a blanket around my legs. The woods were darker than before. The moon was hidden behind clouds. I had the torch resting in my lap but didn't turn it on. I wanted to let my eyes adjust to the dark, to see if I could hear the owls or the foxes again. But it felt different now, like I wasn't alone. At one point, I thought I heard soft footsteps behind the trees, just beyond the clearing. A slow, deliberate crunching of leaves. I froze, holding my breath. Then silence again. I listened for another minute before standing and going back inside. I locked the door and checked it twice. On the third morning, I found something odd outside. A small pile of stones, stacked carefully at the edge of the clearing, about 10 feet from the cabin. 5 stones, each slightly smaller than the one beneath it. It hadn't been there the day before. I went over and looked at it, crouching to see if maybe an animal or the wind had done it. But it was too precise, balanced, like it had been placed there deliberately. I knocked it over and left it in a heap. I spent the rest of that day indoors, reading and keeping the stove going. Around noon, it started raining. A cold, steady drizzle that didn't let up. I didn't feel like going out in it. Every so often, I'd glance out the window, half expecting to see someone in the trees. But there was nothing, just the wet branches swaying in the wind. That night, the sound of rain on the roof made it hard to sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard something, a soft thud, then another. It wasn't inside. It sounded like it came from the porch. I sat up in bed, listening. Another dull knock, like someone lightly tapping the wooden step. I reached for the torch beside the bed and stood slowly. I didn't turn on the lights, didn't want to let whoever was out there know I was awake. I crept toward the window and peered through the gap in the curtain. There was someone standing at the edge of the clearing. I couldn't see her clearly. The rain blurred everything, but the outline was unmistakable. A woman, long coat, hair pulled back, standing in the same place where the stone pile had been that morning. Not moving, just watching. I backed away from the window. My chest was tight. I turned on the torch, then turned it off again. I didn't want her to see the light. I sat on the bed for almost an hour, just listening. No more noises, no more knocks. When I finally looked again, she was gone. I slept with the torch in my hand. The next morning, I found another stone pile. This one was closer, only a few feet from the porch. Same design, 5 stones balanced in a neat stack. I didn't touch it this time. I just stood there, looking at it, heart pounding. I walked the perimeter of the clearing, checking for footprints. The ground was soft, still wet from the rain. Near the tree line, I found what might have been prints, indentations scattered, but it was hard to say for sure. No clear tread marks. That afternoon, I drove back into the village. I thought about asking someone, maybe the shopkeeper, if they knew who she was, but I couldn't make myself do it. What would I say? That I saw a woman in the woods and she built some rock piles? It sounded stupid. Instead, I bought a fresh pack of batteries for the torch, a thermos of tea, and a heavy-duty padlock for the cabin door. I didn't even know if I could install it properly, but I bought it anyway. When I got back, the stone pile was gone. No sign of it. Just a wet patch where the moss had been pressed down. That scared me more than anything. I double-locked the door that night, blocked it with a chair. I didn't go outside. I didn't even light a fire, didn't want to give off any glow that could be seen through the windows. I lay in bed with the torch and a kitchen knife, heart racing at every noise. At some point during the night, I heard a soft scraping sound. Wood on wood. I sat up instantly. The scraping came again, slow and quiet, from just outside the front door. I held my breath. The sound stopped. Then a new sound. Fingernails tapping lightly on the wooden wall. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't move, didn't turn on the torch. I just sat there, frozen, waiting for it to stop. Eventually, it did. I didn't sleep. When daylight came, I waited an extra hour before opening the door. Nothing outside. No footprints. No stone piles. Just cold, wet ground and quiet woods. I packed my things. I told myself I'd had enough, that I didn't need to stay the full week. I'd leave early, find a hotel somewhere. But when I tried to start the car, it didn't turn over. Not even a sound. The battery was dead. I checked the hood, looked for loose cables. Everything seemed in place. I hadn't left any lights on. There was no phone signal in the clearing. I knew that from the first day. I'd have to walk back to the village, maybe 45 minutes if I moved fast. I packed my bag with essentials, locked the cabin, and set off. I was halfway down the gravel path when I saw her again. She was standing in the woods off to the side, maybe 20 yards away. Same dark coat, same silver hair, just watching me. This time I didn't stop. I kept walking, not fast but steady. I didn't look directly at her. I felt her eyes on me until the bend in the path took me out of sight. When I finally reached the village, I went straight to the shop. Told the man at the counter that I needed help with the car. He gave me the number of a mechanic and let me use the phone. Took a few hours, but the man came with a portable jump starter and got the engine running again. I didn't mention the woman. I drove straight home, didn't look back once. For a while, I tried to forget about it. I told myself it was just some strange local. Maybe she lived in the woods. Maybe she was harmless, just eccentric. But 2 weeks later, I found a small pile of stones on my front step. 5 of them balanced perfectly. No one else knew where I had been. I moved flats a month later, and I haven't gone back to the Peak District since. The cabin stood by itself, nestled against the side of a steep hill, surrounded by dense woods. It had been a long day of hiking, and my legs were aching by the time I saw the faint outline of the place through the trees. The sun was beginning to dip behind the horizon, casting an orange glow over the landscape. It looked like the kind of cabin that had been abandoned for years. I wasn't expecting much, just a place to rest for the night before heading back down the trail in the morning. I had planned a quick solo trip up to the northern part of the Adirondacks. I'm in my early 30s, and although I'd been on more than a few hiking trips in my life, I had never really ventured alone into the more isolated areas. This trip was supposed to be an escape from the stresses of work, and I thought it would be good to disconnect for a few days. I'd made sure to pack everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, extra food, and enough water to get me through. As I approached the cabin, I could tell it hadn't seen much upkeep in recent years. The paint was peeling from the walls, the wooden deck was creaky, and there were patches of moss growing along the roof. But the door was slightly ajar, and I was too tired to care about how it looked. I needed rest, and this place seemed as good as any to spend the night. I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The inside was dim, lit only by the fading light from outside and a few gaps in the walls where the wood had rotted away. Dust motes floated in the air, and there was a thick smell of mildew. I set my pack down and took a look around. There was a fireplace against one wall, a few mismatched chairs, and an old wooden table in the center of the room. It felt like the kind of place you wouldn't want to stay in for too long, but for one night it would do. I set about making a fire, gathering some dry twigs from the woodpile outside. After a few minutes of struggling to get a spark, the fire took, crackling to life. The warmth felt good, and the orange glow from the flames bathed the room in a comforting light. I sat back in one of the chairs, my eyes closing for a moment as I relaxed. The wind was picking up outside, and I could hear the trees rustling, their branches creaking under the pressure. The sound was a little unsettling, but nothing I couldn't handle. I felt the first pangs of hunger in my stomach and pulled out a can of beans from my pack. It wasn't much, but it would do. As I ate, I couldn't help but feel like something was off. It was hard to explain, but the place felt wrong. Not in a supernatural sense, but in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't just the decay of the cabin or the strange smell in the air. It was something deeper, like the feeling you get when you're being watched but can't figure out where the gaze is coming from. I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. I had a long day ahead of me tomorrow, and I didn't need to be letting my mind wander. I finished my meal, set the can aside, and got ready for bed. The cabin was small, and the one room where I sat was the only space that seemed habitable. There was an old cot pushed up against one wall, covered in a thick layer of dust. I spread my sleeping bag out and tried to make myself comfortable, but I found myself tossing and turning, unable to shake that feeling of unease. At some point during the night, I heard something outside the cabin. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind, but as I strained my ears, I could make it out. A faint tapping noise. It wasn't a regular sound like branches scraping against the cabin. This was different. It almost sounded like footsteps. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my heart beginning to race. There was no way anyone should be out here at this time of night. The closest town was miles away, and I was on a secluded trail that hardly anyone used. I had seen no one all day. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind. But then the tapping came again, this time louder, closer. I slowly crawled out of my sleeping bag and moved toward the window. The glass was cracked, and a thin layer of dust covered the inside of the frame. I wiped it away, peering out into the night. At first, all I could see were shadows, nothing more. But then, I caught a glimpse of something moving. A figure. It was standing just beyond the trees, a silhouette against the dim light of the moon. My stomach churned. I couldn't make out any details, just a vague outline of a person. The figure didn't move for a long moment, and for a while I wondered if I had imagined it. But then, it shifted slightly, like it had sensed me watching. I pulled back quickly, heart pounding in my chest. What the hell was going on? I moved to the back of the cabin, crouching down beside the old fireplace. I tried to steady my breath, but my mind was racing. Was it possible that someone had followed me here? Had I been seen on the trail earlier in the day? The tapping noise started again, but this time, it wasn't just outside. It was coming from the cabin itself. Soft, rhythmic knocks against the wooden walls, as though someone was tapping with their knuckles. I froze. There was no way I was imagining this. Whoever or whatever was out there, they were moving closer. The air in the cabin felt suddenly thicker, and the shadows seemed to press in around me. The fire flickered, casting long, distorted shapes across the room. The tapping was relentless, growing more insistent. I knew I couldn't just stay hidden here. The figure outside could be dangerous, and if they were trying to get in, I needed to make a decision quickly. I grabbed my pack and slung it over my shoulder, moving quietly toward the back door. The wind howled outside, and I heard the sound of footsteps coming closer. I had to get out. I opened the door slowly, making sure it didn't creak too much. The cold air hit me like a slap in the face, but I didn't care. I needed to get away. I stepped outside, my boots crunching against the gravel. The wind was biting, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me as I moved toward the trees, trying to stay hidden. I didn't look back at the cabin. Couldn't. I kept moving, putting distance between myself and whatever was inside that place. The woods around me were thick, but I knew I had to keep going. I didn't know who that figure was or what they wanted, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I kept walking through the night, my legs aching and my mind filled with nothing but the need to escape. Eventually, I found a small clearing, and I paused there, panting from exhaustion. I looked around, making sure no one was following me, but the woods were silent again. It was almost as if whatever had been there before had vanished into thin air. I didn't stop moving until I reached the main trail, where I finally felt some measure of safety. I pulled out my phone to check the map, hoping to find a nearby ranger station or shelter, but the signal was weak. Still, I pressed on, determined to get to civilization. By the time I reached a nearby road, the first light of dawn was starting to break. The sun was rising over the horizon, and I could finally take a deep breath. I wasn't sure what had happened that night or who that man was, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going back to that cabin. It was the kind of trip you plan on a whim. Nothing special, no big occasion, just a need to get away from the noise of everyday life. My name's James, and I had just turned 28. At the time, I'd been working long hours in a city job that drained me more than I'd realized. The thought of a cabin in the woods seemed like the perfect escape. I rented the cabin online in a remote part of the mountains in Idaho. A small place tucked away in a thick patch of trees, away from the nearest town. It wasn't exactly a luxurious place, no running water, just a well for drinking water, a wood stove, and a small kitchen. The owner's description made it sound rustic but charming. I drove up there in my truck, alone. No friends, no family, just me and the quiet. It was mid-September, just as the air started to turn crisp, and the trees were still mostly green with hints of yellow at the edges. The drive was long. I hadn't realized how far out it was when I made the reservation. My truck bounced and jostled over dirt roads for hours before I finally saw the cabin through the trees. It sat back in the woods, a simple one-story wooden structure with a small porch and a few windows. No electricity, no neighbors. The perfect place to get some peace. I unloaded my things: food, water, a few books, and a sleeping bag, and stepped inside. The air smelled like pine and earth, and the wood inside the cabin had a musty, lived-in scent. There was a single bed, a small couch, and a coffee table. A fireplace sat in the corner, ready for a fire. The space was cozy, nothing fancy, but it felt right. I set up my sleeping bag and unpacked the rest of my gear. For the first couple of hours, I didn't think about much. I started a fire, made some food, and just listened to the crackling of the wood. The sound of the forest outside was alive with birds, the wind, and the occasional rustle of leaves. There was a comfort in that sound, a peace that I hadn't realized I needed. As the day turned into night, the woods around me grew quiet. The sun slipped behind the mountains, leaving the cabin in shadow. The fire was the only light now, flickering and casting shadows on the walls. I sat on the couch, watching the flames dance, when I heard something. It was faint, just a sound on the wind. A knock, maybe. Tap. A low thud. I got up and walked over to the door, but there was nothing. The cabin was surrounded by trees. No cars, no signs of anyone. I stepped out onto the porch, looking around in the fading light, but saw nothing. Only the darkening forest, the kind of dark that feels heavy. I didn't think much of it at the time, probably just a branch falling or an animal brushing against the cabin. But as the night grew deeper, the sounds came again. A tap on the side of the cabin, followed by a scrape. A low sound, like something dragging across the wood. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. I went back inside and locked the door, though I didn't feel like I was in danger. It was the first time I felt uneasy in the cabin. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. That night, I slept fitfully. Every time I was on the edge of falling asleep, a noise would wake me. Something scraping at the walls or a soft thud from outside. I didn't get much rest, but I told myself it was just the woods being what they were. The unknown can make even the most familiar places feel strange, especially at night. The next morning, I woke up early, the sun barely peeking over the trees. I made coffee and sat on the porch, watching the fog lift from the valley below. The air was still, and the only sound was the occasional chirp of a bird. For a moment, everything felt normal again. I spent the day walking around the woods, trying to clear my head. The quiet of the forest was soothing, and I lost myself in the rhythm of walking, in the simple act of moving through the trees. The cabin felt distant now, just a place I passed through on my way deeper into the woods. As I walked, I came across a trail. It wasn't marked, but it seemed like someone had walked there before. It was thin, winding through thick trees, and it looked like it went on for miles. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow it. The trail led me higher into the mountains, and the further I went, the quieter it became. The sound of the forest faded, replaced by an eerie stillness. I had been walking for about an hour when I came to a clearing. At the center of the clearing was an old cabin. The roof was caving in, the windows were shattered, and the wooden walls were rotting. It looked abandoned. I didn't want to go inside, but something about it pulled me in. Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe it was the silence. But I walked up to it cautiously. I approached the door, which was barely hanging on its hinges. I pushed it open, and the inside was covered in dust and decay. A once cozy fireplace sat in the corner, but it was filled with broken bricks. The floor creaked under my weight as I moved inside. The whole cabin smelled of mold and rot. Then I saw something strange. A piece of fabric tucked behind a beam in the corner. It was a dark, heavy cloth like something you would wear for work in the field. I crouched down to get a closer look, and that's when I noticed something else. There were tracks on the floor, freshly disturbed, like someone had been here recently. I froze. My heart began to race. The feeling I had earlier in the night, the sense that something wasn't right, was back. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I left the cabin quickly, my mind racing. I wasn't alone in the woods. I retraced my steps, walking back down the trail. The cabin was still far behind me, and I felt the weight of it in the pit of my stomach. Every rustle in the trees seemed too loud. Every crack of a twig beneath my feet felt too sharp. I reached the main trail and decided to head back to the cabin. The sun was starting to set again, casting long shadows through the trees. When I got back to the cabin, everything seemed still, too still. I didn't go inside right away. I stood on the porch looking around. It felt like the forest was watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was close. Someone who knew the woods better than I did. Someone who had been here long before me. The night was coming fast, and with it came the sounds. The tapping on the cabin walls, the dragging sound that sent chills through my body. I locked the door again and sat by the fire, trying to stay calm. But I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin I had found in the woods. The rest of the night passed in fits of restless sleep, interrupted by those strange sounds. I didn't dare leave the cabin again. The next morning, I packed my things. I didn't want to be there any longer. The woods had given me a sense of dread I couldn't ignore. I knew I'd be safe once I left, but it didn't erase the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. I drove away in the early hours, the cabin shrinking in my rearview mirror. The road was empty, just me and the mountains. And as I drove back to civilization, I couldn't help but wonder who had been in that abandoned cabin, and more importantly, if they were still watching. The wind had picked up sharply as I drove deeper into the woods, the tall pines swaying slightly in the breeze. The kind of wind that made you feel like the forest was alive, watching, waiting. My name's Ben Carter. I'm 32 years old, and I've been a park ranger at Larkspur Lake for the past 4 years. It's remote, the kind of place you only really know about if you've lived in the area for years. I used to enjoy the solitude, the peace of it all. Now, though, I've started to feel differently about the place, like something's changed, like there's a new kind of quiet that I can't shake off. It was late September, and the autumn chill had already begun to creep into the nights. I remember thinking, as I turned onto the gravel road that led to the ranger's cabin, that I was just about done with this job. The late nights, the isolation, it was wearing me down. But it was just one more shift, and then I'd be off to something else. Maybe I'd find work at a wildlife center in the city or try to get a position at one of the national parks. Something with people. That was the plan anyway. The cabin sat tucked into a small clearing, hidden from the lake by a row of thick evergreens. It had been built decades ago, with logs stacked high and a steep roof that always seemed to have a bit of snow on it, even when there wasn't much on the ground. It was small, cozy, if you could ignore the fact that it had no phone service and no real connection to the outside world except the occasional supply run. As I parked the truck and grabbed my gear, I could feel that familiar weight of the place. It was quiet, too quiet maybe. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the gravel as I walked to the front door. Inside, I dropped my bag by the door and set my boots in the corner. I was supposed to be checking on the lake, making sure the trail markers were in place, maybe do a little maintenance on the dock, but that could wait. My shift wasn't due to start for a few more hours, and I had plenty of time. So I decided to relax for a bit before the work began. The silence in the cabin was almost oppressive, the kind that felt thick in the air, like it was pressing down on you. I made a quick fire in the stove and curled up in a chair with a book I'd brought. It wasn't long before the wind picked up outside again, this time rattling the windows in their frames. That was when I heard the knock. I froze, my book slipping from my hands and hitting the floor with a dull thud. No one came out here. It was too remote. The closest town was a solid hour away, and no one ever came by unless there was some kind of emergency. The knock came again, 3 short, sharp raps on the front door. I stood up slowly, feeling the tension in my chest rise. It was late, too late for anyone to be out this way. I grabbed my flashlight from the counter and approached the door. For a split second, I thought about calling the local sheriff's office, just in case. But something held me back. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was just the silence of the place sinking into my bones. When I opened the door, there was no one there. Just the faint sound of the wind howling through the trees. I looked around, squinting into the darkness. Nothing, just the shadows of the trees and the overcast sky above. I was about to shut the door and go back inside when something caught my eye. A set of footprints in the soft dirt in front of the porch. The footprints were fresh, the edges of the prints still sharp. I bent down to examine them. They weren't the prints of a deer or anything I'd seen before. They were too deep and too wide, almost like someone had been wearing heavy boots. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, and I stood up quickly. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing on end. The woods around me felt too still, too quiet. I stepped back inside, locked the door, and double-checked the windows. It was probably nothing. Maybe some hiker or a tourist who'd gotten lost. But as I went back to the fire and tried to settle, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The rest of the night dragged on. I stayed in the cabin, keeping busy with small tasks, but the unease never left. I kept checking the windows, looking for movement in the shadows. I couldn't help but feel that someone was out there, lurking in the dark. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to go check the trail. The last thing I wanted was for someone to stumble upon the cabin in the middle of the night and get freaked out. So, I grabbed my flashlight, slung my jacket over my shoulder, and stepped outside into the crisp night air. The trail leading to the lake was just a few hundred yards from the cabin. As I walked, I kept the beam of the flashlight swinging back and forth, scanning the path for anything out of place. The trees were bare, their branches reaching up into the night sky like skeletal fingers. It was unnerving, being out there alone in the dark, but I had a job to do, and this was just part of it. When I reached the lake, I stopped to take a breath. The air felt thick and heavy, almost suffocating. The lake itself was calm, but the mist that hung low over the water seemed unnatural, like it was hiding something beneath its surface. I checked the dock, made sure the boards were still secure. Then I began walking the trail that looped around the water. The further I went, the more I felt like I was being followed. The crunch of my boots on the dirt was the only sound, but every now and then, I swore I could hear something else. A rustle in the bushes, the snap of a twig underfoot. It was subtle, but it was there. At the far end of the trail, where the trees began to thicken again, I stopped. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and my hand instinctively went to the knife I kept in my belt. I glanced around. There was something in the air, something off. I didn't hear it at first, the faint sound of breathing, shallow and fast. I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The beam of the flashlight landed on a figure standing at the edge of the trees. A man. He was standing still, his hands hanging limply at his sides, staring straight ahead. His face was obscured by shadows, but I could see enough to know he wasn't supposed to be out here. I didn't know what to do. I felt the weight of the night pressing in on me, the cold creeping up my spine. I took a step forward, then another, my breath coming in short bursts. I called out, but my voice came out too shaky, too uncertain. The man didn't move, didn't respond, and then in an instant I knew he wasn't going to. He was just there, watching, waiting. I turned on my heel and ran. The sound of my boots hitting the trail echoed in the dark, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I sprinted back toward the cabin. My pulse was racing, and all I could think about was getting inside, locking the door, and never leaving again. I didn't stop until I reached the cabin. I slammed the door shut behind me, double-locked it, and slid the bolt across. My hands were shaking as I leaned against the door, trying to steady myself. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I didn't sleep, couldn't. I kept the light on and the fire crackling, but every noise outside made my heart skip a beat. There was no sign of the man when I finally gathered the courage to look out the window. The trail was empty. The woods were still. By morning, the fog had lifted, and the sun was creeping over the horizon. I knew I couldn't stay another night. The man, whoever he was, would be back. I packed up my things, left the cabin, and drove back to the ranger station. I reported the incident, but they told me there was nothing they could do. No one had been reported missing, and no one was found in the area. It was as if the man had never been there, but I knew he was, and every time I close my eyes, I can still see him standing at the edge of those trees, just watching, waiting for me to come back. It was the kind of weekend I had been looking forward to for months. A break from the city, from work, from the chaos of daily life. The cabin my brother, Luke, had rented was secluded, deep in the forests of northern Montana. The air was fresh and cool, and the trees around us were dense, tall, and seemingly endless. It was perfect, just what I needed to clear my head. We were supposed to stay for 3 days, just me, Luke, and a few of his buddies. They were all outdoor types, campers, hunters, people who could survive in the woods without missing a beat. As for me, I wasn't the most experienced, but I liked the idea of disconnecting and spending some time away from technology. Luke had been to this cabin before, so he knew the area well. The cabin itself was small but sturdy. It was made of rough-hewn logs, nestled among trees with a small porch out front. Inside, it had a stone fireplace, old wooden furniture, and a couple of bunk beds. The place had character, but you could tell it hadn't been updated in a while. Dust had collected in some corners, and the wood floors creaked underfoot. We arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was setting behind the mountains. The sky had that deep purple color, and the first stars began to appear. We carried our bags inside, unpacked a bit, and settled in. I could tell my brother was eager to get the fire going, so he immediately started gathering logs and arranging them in the fireplace. The others went outside to explore the surrounding woods, and I stayed inside to relax, flipping through a book I had brought along. It wasn't long before the fire crackled to life, sending warmth through the small cabin. Luke, who had been talking about hunting earlier, started cleaning his gear. I watched him for a while, lost in thought, as the flames danced and flickered. Around dusk, we had dinner. The food was simple, just some canned goods, some fresh vegetables we had brought along, and a couple of steaks. After eating, we sat by the fire for a while. The others were quiet, lost in their own thoughts, and I wasn't sure if it was the isolation or the cold air, but there was something unsettling about the stillness of the place. The only sound was the occasional crackle from the fire and the rustling of the leaves outside. Night fell fast in the forest. The temperature dropped, and the air became crisp. I retreated inside to the warmth of the cabin, and the others followed. We played a few rounds of cards, but the conversation was slow, like everyone was either tired or distracted. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was too quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. Luke and the others stayed up, talking and drinking beer, but I retreated to the bunk bed where I'd be sleeping. The sheets were cold at first, but they warmed up quickly. The cabin creaked and groaned as the night settled in, but I didn't mind it much. I just pulled the blanket up around me and tried to sleep. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. I kept hearing strange noises outside the cabin, things that didn't seem quite right. There were twigs snapping, soft footsteps crunching on the ground, and the occasional rustle of leaves. At first, I figured it was just animals, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the noises didn't stop. They were persistent, and they seemed to be getting closer. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. After all, we were in the woods, surrounded by nature. But the unease lingered. I stayed awake, staring at the wooden ceiling above me, trying to ignore the sounds outside. My eyes kept darting to the window, where the moonlight filtered in through the trees, casting long shadows across the floor. It wasn't until I heard a distinct knock on the door that my heart skipped a beat. It was faint at first, like someone tapping gently on wood. I waited, frozen in place, listening carefully. Then it came again, another tap, this time louder. My body stiffened. No one had mentioned anything about neighbors or other cabins nearby. Why would someone be knocking in the middle of the night? I glanced toward the living area. The others were still up, talking. I heard their muffled voices in the background, but no one seemed to react to the knock. Maybe it was just a tree branch tapping against the door, I thought. Maybe. But the knock came again. This time I got up. My feet felt like lead as I walked toward the door, hesitant. I reached for the handle, but something stopped me. A strange sense of dread washed over me, and I pulled my hand back. I wasn't alone in this cabin. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. Someone was out there, and they knew I was here. I slowly backed away from the door and sat back down on the bed. I couldn't sleep after that. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who would be out there at this hour? And why didn't anyone else hear it? I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the forest, but the knocking never came again. The next morning, the sun rose over the trees, bringing with it the fresh, cool air of a new day. I tried to shake off the unsettling feeling from the night before, telling myself it was just my imagination. Maybe it had been a tree branch or an animal or maybe even the wind. But I couldn't help but glance nervously at the door when I woke up. I joined the others outside for breakfast. Luke was already up and making coffee on the small stove, and the others were lounging around the porch talking about going hunting. I couldn't focus on what they were saying. I kept thinking about the knock. "What's wrong with you?" Luke asked when he noticed my distracted state. "You look like you saw a ghost." I didn't want to admit what had happened the night before, so I just shrugged. "I didn't sleep much. I heard some strange noises." "What kind of noises?" he asked, a bit too casually. "Just some tapping on the door," I said, still trying to downplay it. "Probably a branch or something." He chuckled. "You've been living in the city too long. Out here, you're gonna hear things you can't explain. It's just nature." I wanted to believe him, but something told me this was more than just nature. The day passed slowly. We hiked a bit into the woods, Luke and his friends talking about old hunting stories. I tried to keep up, but my mind kept wandering back to the strange knocking I'd heard. After lunch, we all decided to head down to a nearby lake to do some fishing. It was a peaceful, quiet spot, surrounded by trees. The water was clear, and the air smelled like fresh pine. But even here, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something or someone lurking in the woods. Luke and the others didn't seem to notice, but I could feel the tension growing inside me. That evening, after we returned to the cabin, things took a strange turn. As we sat around the fire, I noticed something odd. One of the windows was open. I knew I hadn't left it that way. The others hadn't either. But there it was, wide open, letting in the cool night air. "Luke," I said, my voice tight, "did you open that window?" He glanced over at it, then shook his head.
No.
"You sure you didn't do it?" I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. "I didn't do it." I walked over to the window, the same sense of dread from last night creeping back into my chest. I could see nothing but the dark trees outside, stretching on into the distance. But as I looked, I felt something shift in the air. A presence, like someone or something, was there, hidden among the shadows. It was then that I realized something had been out there all along. Someone had been watching us, and now they were waiting. The next few hours passed in a blur. I don't even remember how it happened, but by the time the sun came up, the woods were empty. The others were gone, leaving behind only the faintest traces of their presence. I don't know where they went or what happened to them, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back to that cabin again. That's where my story ends. The events that transpired after that night have remained a mystery to me, but I know I'll never forget the fear I felt or the quiet presence that haunted the woods. Some doors should never be opened, and some places should never be explored. And now, as I sit here, far away from that cabin in the woods, I realize that whatever was out there is still out there, and it's waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler to cross its path. It was the middle of October when I decided to take my dog, Max, and spend a weekend alone in a cabin out in the woods. The cabin was small, tucked away in the mountains of North Carolina. I had rented it out from a small agency that specialized in secluded getaways. I had been working nonstop for months, and the stress had started to wear on me. I thought getting away, even if just for a couple of days, would help clear my mind. Max, my golden retriever, was my constant companion. He was 6 years old, still full of energy but also well-behaved. He had been my rock after everything that had happened in the last few years. The cabin was supposed to be peaceful. No one around, no distractions, just me and Max, surrounded by nature, the perfect place to unwind. I left my house early that morning, well before the sun had fully risen. The drive took longer than I expected, the roads winding up into the foothills and then deeper into the forest. The landscape started to change as I got farther from civilization. The trees grew taller, the air fresher. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, it was late afternoon, and the sun had already begun to dip low in the sky. The cabin itself was old, built sometime in the 1940s, from what I had gathered. It wasn't anything fancy, just a single room with a small kitchen area, a wood stove in the corner, and a simple wooden bed. The place was surrounded by tall pines and a few scattered birch trees, their white bark stark against the darkening sky. Max hopped out of the truck, his tail wagging. He was always excited for an adventure, and the cabin seemed to ignite a certain energy in him. I unloaded my bags, setting up inside while Max roamed the area, sniffing at everything. The evening was cool, and the smell of pine and fresh earth filled the air. The place felt like it was in the middle of nowhere, which was exactly what I wanted. The first night was uneventful. I spent the evening cooking a simple meal and sitting by the wood stove, reading a book as Max lay on the floor next to me, content and quiet. The world outside was still, save for the occasional rustling of leaves. I didn't expect anything to happen that night, but then again, I didn't expect much to happen over the entire trip. I just wanted peace and quiet, but that peace was short-lived. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to Max growling low in his throat. His body was tense, and he was standing by the door, staring into the dark woods outside. It was strange because he never acted like this. Max had always been a calm dog, even when something unusual happened. But tonight, something was different. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the grogginess. "What's wrong, boy?" I muttered under my breath, getting up and walking over to him. He didn't budge. The growl deepened, a low, rumbling sound in his chest. I turned to look outside, but all I could see was a wall of darkness. The trees were still, not a leaf moving. There was no wind, the kind of silence that fills your ears and makes your thoughts louder than they should be. Max continued to growl, his eyes focused on something beyond the door, something I couldn't see. A few minutes passed, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I had a feeling, a deep sense of unease, that something was wrong. It wasn't the normal quiet of the night. It felt like someone was out there, just beyond the reach of the shadows. I hesitated for a moment, then grabbed a flashlight from the counter. I figured I'd step outside, check around the cabin, and make sure everything was fine. Max was reluctant to follow me as I opened the door, but I gave him a pat on the head, and he reluctantly trotted out with me, his tail down, eyes scanning the darkness. The beam of the flashlight flicked across the trees, the ground, and up to the roof of the cabin. Nothing, but the hairs on the back of my neck didn't settle. I scanned the area again, the beam of light catching odd shadows in the distance. A few seconds later, I thought I saw something, a movement, something large, just beyond the edge of the trees. My heart skipped a beat, and my stomach turned. I knew what I was seeing. I knew it didn't make sense, but in the back of my mind, it felt like the shape of a person, crouched low, hidden behind the trees. Max suddenly lunged forward, barking furiously. I jerked the leash, pulling him back, but it was too late. The thing I thought I saw in the trees moved. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could hear the soft crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. I froze, holding my breath. There were no other houses around. No one else was supposed to be here. I slammed the door shut, bolting it behind me. Max was still frantic, pacing the cabin, his low growl becoming louder. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. Nothing but the dead silence of the woods pressing in on me. I tried to calm myself. It was just my nerves, I told myself. It had to be. but the anxiety wouldn't leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching, waiting. I spent the rest of the night lying in bed, wide awake, listening for any sound. Max stayed at the door, keeping his eyes on the woods. The next morning, I made my coffee and sat by the window, trying to shake the unease from the night before. The woods were calm now, bathed in early morning sunlight. Max was still on edge, but after a few hours, he settled down, curling up by the stove. I took a deep breath, determined not to let the paranoia get the best of me. I spent most of the day hiking along the trails around the cabin, trying to clear my mind. But Max stayed close, more so than usual. He wouldn't leave my side, constantly watching the woods, sniffing at the air. Even when we stopped for a break, he wouldn't sit down, always standing guard. I tried to push it aside as just him being protective, but it felt like he knew something I didn't. As the evening approached, the sky darkened quickly, and the air grew colder. I started preparing dinner, trying to focus on the task at hand. I didn't want to think about what happened the night before. Max suddenly perked up again, his ears swiveling toward the door. His body went rigid, and his eyes locked onto something in the distance. I froze. There it was again, a feeling of being watched. I grabbed the flashlight and went outside. The sun had barely set, leaving the sky a dim shade of blue. I scanned the area, shining the beam over the trees, the underbrush, the ground. And then I saw it. A figure. Someone standing just beyond the clearing at the edge of the trees, watching the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest. It was a man. His face was obscured by the shadows, but I could see enough to know he wasn't supposed to be here. I didn't know what to do. If I called out to him, he might run. If I stayed quiet, he might come closer. Either way, I was trapped here with no way to defend myself. And Max, he wasn't exactly a guard dog. The figure didn't move, just stood there. The only sound was the rustling of the leaves. I backed away slowly, holding my breath. I wasn't sure if he saw me, but I didn't want to take any chances. I bolted inside the cabin, locking the door behind me. Max was growling now, louder than before. His agitation was palpable. I glanced out the window again, but the figure was gone. I spent the rest of the night inside, the cabin feeling smaller, colder, and more isolated than ever. Max remained on edge, his eyes darting toward the door at every noise. I was tense too, unable to shake the feeling that someone was out there. The morning came slowly, the sunlight creeping through the cracks in the shutters. I was exhausted both physically and mentally, but as the light of day filled the cabin, I decided to leave. I packed my things quickly, trying to keep my nerves steady. Max was calm, but his head kept turning toward the trees, as if he were waiting for something. Before I left, I checked around the cabin again. No sign of the man, no tracks, nothing to suggest anyone had been there. As I drove back down the winding roads, the forest stretching out behind me, I couldn't help but feel relief. But there was also something nagging at the back of my mind. Something wasn't right. It was almost like I had narrowly escaped something. I didn't know if I was just paranoid or if there really had been someone watching me. Either way, I'd never forget that feeling of being watched, and I'd never go back to that cabin. The evening was colder than usual for early October, the sky a slate gray, stretching endlessly over the quiet stretch of land I had chosen to camp on. I had driven for hours to get here, the road narrow and winding as I ventured deeper into the heart of nowhere. The cabin I'd rented sat at the edge of a forgotten cemetery, its weathered stone walls and crooked windows giving off a strange vibe. But I didn't think much of it. I liked the solitude, the quiet, and the challenge of staying alone in a place where few had dared to camp. The cemetery was old, really old, its headstones leaning at odd angles, many cracked or half buried in the dirt. Some of the graves had been here for more than 100 years, a testament to the forgotten lives that once inhabited this patch of earth. It was the perfect setting for someone like me, who preferred isolation over company. The leaves of the trees surrounding the cabin had started to turn, hues of yellow and orange scattered against the darker green of the evergreens. The air smelled of damp earth, fallen leaves, and the faint scent of wood smoke from nearby houses, though there were no houses for miles. I parked my truck near the cabin and unloaded my gear. The cabin was small, more of a shack than anything else, with a low roof and a single creaky door. Inside, there were a few simple furnishings: an old wood-burning stove, a rickety table, a single bed with a thick quilt, and a couple of mismatched chairs. The floor creaked under my boots as I set up my things, unpacking the camping stove and making a cup of coffee. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves outside and the soft crackle of the stove. It was then that I noticed something odd. The cemetery, which I had thought was deserted, seemed strangely alive. I had seen no one when I arrived. No caretakers, no visitors. But as I sipped my coffee, I noticed figures out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just the wind pushing the trees around, but there was a pattern to the movement. Someone or something was walking through the cemetery, moving between the gravestones, almost as if it were circling the perimeter. My heart rate picked up a little, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just a neighbor, though there didn't seem to be any nearby. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I convinced myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. I turned my attention back to the small, flickering fire in the stove, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that gnawed at the pit of my stomach. The light outside was beginning to fade, and soon, darkness crept over the land, wrapping everything in an inky blackness that swallowed the world whole. I turned on a small lantern inside the cabin, its yellow glow offering little comfort in the overwhelming stillness. As I finished my coffee, I decided to head outside to stretch my legs. The air had a crisp chill to it now, and the moon had started to rise, casting a silvery light over the cemetery and the surrounding woods. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out the door, the wooden steps creaking underfoot as I descended. I walked toward the cemetery, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. As I approached the edge, I noticed the same figures moving again, still pacing between the graves. But now something was different. The shapes were closer, too close, and they weren't just walking. They were moving with purpose, as though they were watching me. I froze. My first instinct was to turn back to the cabin, to lock myself inside and forget I'd ever set foot in this eerie place. But curiosity got the better of me, and I stood there in the cold air, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figures weren't human, at least not in the way I understood. Their movements were too jerky, too unnatural. They didn't walk like people. They moved in strange, sudden bursts, their forms shifting in the shadows. I turned the flashlight off, hoping that by doing so, I might be able to see more clearly. The moonlight now bathed the cemetery in an almost surreal glow, but still, I couldn't make out exactly what the figures were. They weren't close enough for me to make a positive identification, but I felt like I was being observed, my every move scrutinized from the shadows. My pulse raced, and I took a step back toward the cabin. But then, another movement caught my eye. A figure darted from behind a gravestone, too quick for a human to move with such speed. This time, it was unmistakable. A tall, shadowy figure, its outline barely visible against the backdrop of the cemetery. It was close, too close. I snapped back to the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest, and I could feel the weight of the moment settle heavily over me. Inside, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. My hands were trembling, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The rest of the night passed in a strange, unsettling silence. Every creak of the cabin's old timbers Every gust of wind that rattled the trees made my skin crawl. I spent the next few hours sitting by the stove, staring at the fire, listening for any sounds coming from the outside. The cemetery, though now silent, felt like it was pressing in on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was waiting just beyond the threshold of the cabin, lurking in the shadows of the graveyard. By the time morning came, I was exhausted, but a sense of clarity had settled over me. Whatever I had seen the night before had been my imagination, or so I told myself. I was alone in a cabin, in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by eerie silence. Of course, my mind had played tricks on me. It was nothing more than a trick of the light, shadows in the dark. I spent the day exploring the surrounding area, walking through the woods and taking in the fresh, crisp air. But the unease didn't leave me. It lingered in the back of my mind, a quiet whisper that I couldn't quite shake. That night, I decided to stay inside the cabin, keeping the door locked and the lantern burning. As the evening wore on, I noticed something strange. The cemetery was not as still as it had been. I couldn't make out any figures in the distance, but the ground around the gravestones looked disturbed. The earth had been recently dug up, but there were no signs of anyone having come through. There was no recent burial. No grave had been disturbed, at least not by the hands of any normal person. By the time I finally decided to leave, my unease was unbearable. I packed my things, determined to leave this place behind. As I loaded my gear into the truck, I looked one last time at the cemetery, now bathed in the early morning light. The graves stood as they had for years, silent and still. That's when I noticed it. The old wooden bench at the far side of the cemetery, partially hidden behind a tree. It wasn't there before. It was new, too new. The wood was fresh, the edges still rough, and the grain of the wood still faintly smelled of sawdust. I didn't stay long enough to find out what it meant. I started my truck and drove away, the cabin and the strange cemetery fading into the rearview mirror. The uneasy feeling lingered, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever had happened there, whatever I had seen or felt, would stay behind in that place. It wasn't for me to understand. The drive back felt like a weight had lifted. I was free, leaving that unease and mystery behind. But even now, as I think back on that night, I can't help but wonder, who or what had been pacing the graveyard that night? What did it want from me? And why had I been so determined to leave before I found out? I never went back. But sometimes, when I drive past places like that, the ones with the old cemeteries and the abandoned cabins, I can't help but wonder what still waits out there, hidden in the dark. I was 38 that year. I'd saved up for over a decade to finally buy a small plot of land in western Arkansas, near the edge of the Ouachita National Forest. I grew up in Tennessee, worked construction jobs most of my life, and got tired of living paycheck to paycheck in some apartment that barely felt like mine. I didn't have kids or a wife, just a few close friends who'd all scattered across the South over the years. So when the chance came to buy 10 acres of thick, wooded land far from everything, I took it. I wanted peace. I wanted to build something from the ground up with my own hands. I had no plans for electricity, no plumbing, no fancy setup. Just a solid one-room cabin where I could spend the colder months. Maybe hunt a little. Maybe read by lantern light and sleep without hearing cars or sirens. It was mid-November when I started hauling tools and materials to the site. I cleared the spot myself in September, dragged out stumps with a winch, hauled gravel in from a buddy's truck. I'd stacked the treated wood I'd bought during a summer sale in plastic and tarps. I kept everything dry because I knew the Arkansas rains would come in hard. And they did. I had maybe 3 walls framed by the end of the second week of work. The days were short, and the sun dropped behind the trees earlier than I liked. The air had that cold bite that comes before snow, but there was no snow in the forecast, just rain, and it came all at once. That night started normal. I was staying in a canvas wall tent I'd put up maybe 60 feet from the cabin site. It was heavy duty, and I'd rigged it with a small wood stove that I ran sparingly, mostly when I needed to dry out or heat up food. The cabin framing was upright, but I hadn't gotten the roof up yet. I'd set up sawhorses and gear under a makeshift tarp roof near the structure, just to keep the area workable. The rain started around 5 in the evening, just as I was cutting a new floor beam. I packed up fast, not wanting to get tools wet. I remember the sound of it. It wasn't gradual. It was like someone just opened a faucet overhead. By 6, it was dark, and by 7, it was louder than anything I'd heard in months. I was reading a book inside the tent when I first noticed something was wrong. Not something obvious, just a feeling. That kind of inner twinge you get when something doesn't line up. I kept thinking I heard something besides rain. Not thunder, not branches falling, just something else. I tried ignoring it. I kept the lantern low, cracked the tent flap, and looked toward the cabin site. All I could see were trees and black shapes. Rain shimmered through the lantern light. I figured maybe I was just spooked from being alone too long. My phone had no signal out here. Closest paved road was 5 miles away. The trail to get to the site was all mud now. It must have been close to 9 when I heard it again. This time it was clearer. Something metal, not from inside the tent, not anything I was using. A hollow clink, like metal brushing against something hard. I held still. I listened for a long time. The rain muffled everything, but between gusts, I could pick out small sounds. Something was moving near the structure. I stepped outside, holding the lantern in front of me. The wind hit me hard, cold and sharp. The water soaked through my jacket almost instantly. I walked toward the cabin site slowly, my boots squishing into the mud. I should have been more afraid, but I was more annoyed at first. Maybe an animal had wandered into my gear. I'd had raccoons drag stuff off before, but nothing big, nothing that made noise like that. I rounded the tarp wall and stood near the sawhorses. Everything looked untouched. Tools were where I left them, except one thing. My framing hammer was gone. That hammer had been on the top of the stack in the plastic toolbox. The lid was still closed. I even bent down and opened it to be sure. It wasn't there. Then I heard it again, faint and behind me this time. A metallic knock. I turned, shining the lantern back toward the trees. Nothing, just shapes, trees, and rain. I backed away and walked the perimeter. The framing stood tall in the mud. For posts, some beams, partial walls. I circled around it and nearly slipped in a pool of water near the back corner. That's when I noticed the mud prints. Not boots like mine, barefoot, human, toes and heel prints, some deep, some shallow. And they weren't old. I felt it in my throat first, like the breath caught. I wasn't afraid like a child gets afraid. I've seen rough people, worked rough jobs, been in bad parts of cities. But this was different. No one was supposed to be out here. Nobody sane walked around barefoot in November rain at night in the woods. Not unless they were desperate or out of their mind. I followed the prints for a short distance. They weaved through the mud toward the tree line. They weren't running. They were walking slow, steady. I turned back toward the tent and almost sprinted the whole way. I kept the lantern high, sweeping the dark. When I got to the tent, I looked over everything. I shut the lantern, zipped the flap, and sat there in the dark, waiting, listening. Couldn't sleep. The hammer missing. The prints. It wasn't some wild animal. Someone was there. Hours passed. The rain never let up. I stayed dressed, boots on, and kept the hatchet beside me. I didn't start a fire. I didn't want any light drawing attention. Sometime past midnight, I heard movement again. Not near the cabin, near the tent. Footsteps, squishing, slow, deliberate. I didn't move. My heart pounded in my chest like a drum. Then something scraped across the tent wall. Soft, just once. A drag of something dull along the canvas. I held my breath for what felt like a full minute. Then I reached and slowly unzipped the flap just an inch. Nothing but blackness outside. I didn't dare shine the lantern again. I waited. The sound didn't come back. By morning, the rain had stopped. Fog hung low over the woods. I opened the flap and stepped out carefully. Everything was soaked. My back was stiff from sitting on edge all night. The first thing I checked was the side of the tent. Sure enough, mud smeared across the canvas in one long line. It was about hip height. Then I checked the cabin site. The hammer was there, propped up against one of the wall studs. Not dropped, placed. I stood staring at it for a long time. I spent that whole day packing my gear. Every last thing. I hauled it all back to my truck by sled. Took multiple trips. Mud slowed everything. I didn't stop to eat. I didn't stop to rest. I left the cabin framing as it was, 3 walls, half floor. Never finished it. I filed a report at the sheriff's office the next day. They said it was probably some drifter, but I know how to read people, and I know desperation when I see it. Those footprints weren't from someone lost or looking for shelter. They walked like they knew exactly where they were going. I sold the land 2 months later. I never went back. I was 31 when I finally decided to take a break from everything and disappear for a while. I'd been working in a warehouse just outside Tulsa for 9 years, stuck on the night shift mostly, dealing with freight and forklifts, and the kind of people who talked a lot but never really said anything. It wasn't bad work, just dull. I didn't have a family to worry about, no kids, no wife, nothing like that. I had some money saved up, enough for time off. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just packed my truck with gear, bought a few weeks' worth of canned food, filled a cooler with water and beer, and headed north out of Oklahoma into Kansas. I found the cabin listed online through a quiet backwoods rental site that didn't ask too many questions. It was described as remote, private, and good for hunting, and that was all I needed to hear. It was somewhere east of Russell, Kansas, not far from Wilson Lake, but far enough from town that the roads stopped being paved and started turning into dirt and gravel. The man who rented it out, Roger, I think, left the key in a lockbox by the door and told me over email that he wouldn't be checking in on me. That was perfect. I got there in the middle of the afternoon, sometime in late October 2022. It was cold, clear, and quiet. The cabin sat on the far edge of an old farmstead, tucked into a small patch of trees that had started to lose their leaves. Beyond it stretched a huge field, dried and empty, the soil pale and cracked in places like old paint. The barn nearby looked half collapsed. There were rusty tools, a broken-down tractor, and a couple of empty fuel drums. I parked the truck close to the cabin and walked around for a while to get a feel for the place. It smelled like dirt and dried hay, with a bit of smoke from some old burn pile somewhere off in the distance. Inside, the cabin was simple. 1 bedroom, a wood stove, a kitchen that barely worked, and a small bathroom with a cracked mirror. There was electricity but no internet. I had cell service for about 10 minutes before it dropped and never came back. I didn't care. I liked the quiet. I unloaded my things, made a fire in the stove, and settled in. The first 2 days were peaceful. I read books I'd brought, hiked around the property, and slept like I hadn't in years. The nights were cold and dead silent, with nothing but the occasional sound of wind in the trees or the thump of something falling off the roof. The kind of quiet that gets into your bones. But by the 3rd night, something started to feel off. I'd gone out during the late afternoon for a walk through the field behind the trees. There was a trail that curved around the edge of a dry creek bed and up toward the top of a small hill where an old windmill stood. From up there, you could see for miles flat land stretching out like a brown sea in every direction, broken only by the occasional barbed wire fence or decaying barn. It was a good spot to watch the sun go down. I stayed up there a bit too long and started heading back just as the light was fading. I hadn't brought a flashlight because I hadn't planned on being out so late. By the time I got near the tree line again, it was nearly dark. That's when I noticed something strange in the field. There were tracks in the dirt, boot prints, but they weren't mine. They were wider and deeper, like someone heavier had come through after I'd gone up to the hill. I followed them with my eyes as best I could, and they led toward the cabin. I remember stopping and just standing there for a few seconds, trying to listen. The wind had stopped, and all I could hear was the blood in my ears. I moved fast after that, not running, but walking quick and careful. When I got back to the cabin, nothing looked out of place. The door was locked, windows closed. I went inside and checked everything, room by room. Nothing had been touched. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been nearby. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I went back out to look at the prints again, but they were gone. The ground wasn't soft, but it had held the impressions clear enough the night before. I thought maybe the wind had covered them, but the wind hadn't picked up until after I'd gone inside. I started thinking maybe I'd imagined it. I didn't go walking that day. I stayed close to the cabin, kept a fire going, and tried to relax. But I kept glancing out the windows, especially toward the trees near the back field. Around sunset, I heard something, just once. A loud crack, like a branch snapping, far off in the direction of the barn. I stepped out onto the porch, but I didn't see anything. I left the porch light on that night. That pattern kept going for the next few days. Little things. Footsteps in the dry grass that didn't belong to me. Scratches on the side of the barn that hadn't been there before. Once, when I woke up around 3 in the morning to use the bathroom, I thought I saw a light moving slowly in the trees. Just a faint flicker, like someone holding a candle way out in the distance. But when I pressed my face to the glass, it was gone. On the 6th day, I found something hanging on the porch. It was early, just past sunrise, and I stepped out with my coffee like I'd been doing all week, and there it was. Hanging from the nail where an old wind chime used to be was a rope with a dead bird tied to it. A crow, I think. Its wings were spread wide, and its head had been crushed in. Blood had dried in a dark line down the side of the wall. I stood there holding my coffee, staring at it, not moving for a long time. Then I took it down and tossed it into the woods behind the cabin. That afternoon I drove into the nearest town, Lucas, I think it was, just to be around other people for a bit. I bought more water, filled up on gas, and grabbed a second flashlight. I didn't tell anyone what was happening. I didn't even know how I would explain it if I tried. On the way back, I stopped near the fence line and looked out toward the field. Everything looked the same. Still dry, empty. That night, the power went out. No storm, no wind, just gone. I lit the oil lantern I'd found in the kitchen and sat by the wood stove trying to stay calm. Around midnight, I heard something on the porch, slow, heavy steps, the kind that don't care if you hear them. I didn't move. I sat there holding the flashlight, waiting. The steps came and went. When I finally worked up the courage to check, there was nothing there. But the deadbolt had fresh scratches around it, like someone had tried forcing it with a screwdriver. The next morning, I packed my things. I didn't want to leave in the dark, so I waited until the sun came up, then loaded the truck and locked the cabin behind me. I didn't tell Roger anything when I dropped the key back off. I just drove south, back toward Tulsa, and never looked back. Weeks passed before I started sleeping normally again. And even now, years later, I don't know what was happening at that cabin. There was never a moment where someone jumped out at me or tried breaking in while I was looking, but I felt them there, watching, moving through the woods just out of view. Maybe it was someone squatting in the barn. Maybe it was someone who knew the place better than I did, who'd been there before and didn't want me there. Whatever the reason, I don't go out to places like that anymore. I still like the quiet, but not that kind. Not the kind where something might be walking the fields at night while you sleep, leaving things for you to find in the morning. There's quiet, and then there's that. And that kind of quiet never feels empty. It feels like something is holding its breath, just waiting for you to get close. And I got too close.